Once upon a time in China, back during the Qing dynasty, when Pu Songling was writing his monumental Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, 4 weary merchants arrived at a roadside inn on a chilly October evening. The men were tired and hungry and wanted food and a place to sleep. But alas, there was no room at the inn. The men argued and gesticulated until the old innkeeper gave in and told them he might have a place for them to sleep if they weren't too particular. They weren't. Now recently the old landlord's daughter-in-law had passed away, and her corpse had been placed in an old barn until her husband could buy a coffin. She lay on her bier, clad in a traditional paper robe, behind a curtain at the rear of the chamber. After a hearty meal of noodles, steamed rice, and warm sweet wine, the 4 merchants returned to the barn, where sleeping couches had been set out for them and a lantern left on a table by the front door. The exhausted men fell upon the couches and were soon fast asleep, all except for one. In spite of being dead tired, this man, whose name was Tan, had trouble drifting off. He was apprehensive and found himself staring at the shadows cast by the flickering lantern and listening to the sounds of the night. And because he was awake, he heard the sound of rustling paper and the creaking of the bier, and turning his head, he saw the corpse of the dead woman step from behind the curtain at the end of the room. His heart nearly stopped when he caught sight of the woman's face, which was chalky white as if drained of blood, but which seemed to glow with a strange greenish aura. Tan watched her move, glide in a stealthy manner towards the couch of the sleeping man closest to her, where she stopped, and bending over, blew on the unconscious man's face. After a few minutes, the dead woman left the first man and moved to the next, and blew on his face, then moved to the third man. While the corpse's attention was diverted, Tan managed to pull the covers up over his face, and when he heard the rustling paper which heralded the dead woman's approach, he held his breath. He held his breath and prayed. The corpse bent over Tan and blew a stream of cold, frigidly cold, and disgustingly charnel breath onto the spot where his face was covered by the thin, oh, too thin blanket. Tan had to fight the urge to gag and struggled to hold his breath and remain still until he was on the verge of passing out. After an eternity, which in reality was only a minute or two, Tan again heard the rustling of the dead woman's paper robes. Was she actually leaving him? He then heard the swish of the curtains and the creaking of the bier. Had she gone back to her resting place? Slowly, oh so slowly, Tan lowered his blanket, which seemed to be wet with a greasy, frost-like muck. A greasy, frost-like muck. Tan got up as quietly as he could and tiptoed over to the nearest couch. Gently, he reached down and touched the sleeping man, and then recoiled in horror. His friend was obviously dead. The sound of rustling paper warned Tan of the woman's return, and he barely managed to hide beneath the covers as the dead woman stepped out from behind the drapes. Once again, the corpse stalked over to where Tan pretended to sleep, and once more she hissed a cold, fetid stream of death onto the blanket covering his face. Tan held his breath until he thought he could hold it no more. But finally, the woman returned to her trestle. Tan knew he had to flee. Moving as quietly as possible, he was attempting to retrieve his clothes when he heard the rustling paper, the creaking beer, and the sound of the curtains being pulled aside. The dead woman stood glaring at him. Then, shrieking like a banshee, attacked, arms outstretched, each of her fingers ending in a red-painted nail as long and as sharp as a dagger. Tan ran out into the darkness, and now that he no longer needed to keep quiet, he bellowed at the top of his lungs, screaming for help, while the dead woman glided after him, right on his heels. Arriving at the inn, Tan pounded frantically for admission, but he raised such a clamor the people inside refused to open the door. Then, feeling a blast of fetid and frigidly cold air on the back of his neck, Tan bolted, narrowly dodging the she-creature as she swooped down on him, clawed hands raised. Across from the inn stood a Buddhist temple, and Tan, still screaming for help, understandable but not wise when trying to run, ran to the temple door, where he pounded and pleaded to be let in. But Tan only succeeded in frightening the monks, who thought he was a robber and wouldn't open up. And then she was there, and Tan had no refuge, but ducked behind a nearby willow tree. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse, or hide and seek, as Tan tried to hide behind the too thin willow. Too thin. The corpse would lunge at him, and he would dodge her, over and over and over and over, feigning, dodging, and ducking, until his body was covered in sweat, and his breath came in gasps. And then suddenly, the woman stopped dead, and stood stock still, and pounced. Tan passed out from a combination of exhaustion and sheer terror, and at first, when he regained consciousness, he wondered if he too was dead. The corpse loomed over him, dead again and reduced to little better than a dried-out mummy, her claw-like nails stuck into the bark of the willow, holding it, upright. The monks had emerged from the temple at first light, and upon finding the dazed man and the dead woman, immediately sent for the magistrate, who ordered the remains of the corpse burned. Tan quickly recovered, but went to the magistrate in tears. 4 of us left our village together, but if only I return, the people will think I have done away with the others, murdered them for their money, for their cash. What shall I do? And so the magistrate gave Tan a certificate testifying as to Tan's innocence and explaining that the murdered men had fallen victim to a resuscitated corpse. A resuscitated corpse. If Tan had shown you such a document, would you believe it? Would you? Really? If this is your first visit to my channel, my name is Warren, and I write and tell original ghost stories and original horror stories featuring cryptids such as the Night Floaters, werewolves, and black-eyed children. I hope you will consider subscribing. Till midnight. Cheers!